The cabin hummed with the soft murmur of passengers settling in. Overhead compartments clicked shut, and the faint rustle of safety pamphlets filled the air. But the calm was interrupted by the clear, measured voice of a flight attendant standing near the front row. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you'll have to move to the back," she said, her tone polite yet firm. Heads turned. Whispers fluttered across the rows like ripples in still water. Seated by the window in first class was a woman dressed in understated elegance. She didn't argue. Without hesitation, she stood, gathering her bag with graceful ease, and began walking toward the rear. What no one realized, not even the flight attendant, was that in just 4 minutes, everything about this flight was about to shift. The airport bustled with the usual rhythm of departures. Suitcases rolled over polished tiles, flight announcements echoed overhead, and travelers moved with the urgency of either excitement or obligation. Lillian Hayes moved through Terminal 6 with quiet confidence. Her tailored navy blazer and cream-colored leather handbag set her apart, though she seemed unaware of the attention she subtly commanded. There was no rushing in her steps, only the steady, unhurried pace of someone accustomed to such spaces. Lillian's warm yet distant smile earned polite nods from passing travelers, but she kept to herself, offering little more than a courteous acknowledgement. The boarding process commenced. Lillian approached the gate, handing over her boarding pass to the agent, who greeted her with a professional but friendly tone. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Hayes," the agent said with a smile. With a nod, Lillian stepped onto the jet bridge. The soft click of her heels against the metal floor echoed faintly as she approached the aircraft. At the entrance, 2 flight attendants exchanged greetings with her. She returned their pleasantries and proceeded down the aisle, gracefully sliding into her seat in the first row of the first-class cabin. Lillian carefully placed her handbag into the overhead compartment before lowering herself into the plush window seat. Her gaze wandered thoughtfully across the cabin. Passengers trickled in, some absorbed in their phones, others chatting softly. A few moments later, a man entered, broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. His movements were precise, almost calculated, as he made his way to the front. His eyes flicked toward Lillian for the briefest moment before he continued forward to take a seat across the aisle from her. No words were exchanged, but the brief glance hinted at familiarity. The final passengers boarded. Among them was flight attendant Rachel Dawson, clipboard in hand, moving briskly through the cabin. Her eyes scanned the seating chart, her brow furrowing slightly as she approached first class. Rachel's steps slowed as she paused at Lillian's row, her gaze narrowing slightly as she double-checked her clipboard. With a composed smile, she leaned closer to Lillian. "Excuse me, ma'am. I believe there may have been a mistake with your seat assignment. May I see your boarding pass?" Lillian's expression remained composed, but a flicker of curiosity danced behind her eyes. She retrieved the slip from her pocket and extended it toward Rachel, who studied it carefully. Rachel's brow creased. "I apologize, Miss Hayes, but it appears this seat is reserved. I'll need to relocate you." Lillian's lips curved into a polite but firm smile. "There's no mistake. This is my seat." Rachel hesitated. Her gaze shifted between Lillian and the seating chart, unsure of how to proceed. "Perhaps there's been a mix-up," Rachel offered, her tone softening slightly. "You may have meant to book a seat in the main cabin." "No," Lillian replied calmly. "I booked this seat." Passengers nearby began to take notice, their quiet conversations tapering off. A few pairs of curious eyes peeked over seatbacks. Rachel's posture stiffened under the growing scrutiny, but she pressed on. With a gesture toward the rear of the plane, she attempted one last time. "I can find you a seat closer to the back," she suggested, her voice tight but pleasant. "It's just as comfortable." "I'd rather stay here," Lillian replied without faltering, her words carrying the weight of quiet resolve. The tension hung in the air, stretching thin across the cabin. Rachel's cheeks reddened faintly. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I must insist. Please gather your belongings." For the first time, Lillian's eyes hardened, just barely. The moment lingered. Finally, Lillian let out a quiet sigh. Her movements were slow, deliberate as she stood. She retrieved her bag from the compartment and stepped into the aisle, gracefully weaving past seated passengers. As she passed by, Her eyes briefly met the gaze of the man in the charcoal suit. He watched intently, his expression unreadable. Whatever passed between them lasted only a second before she continued toward the rear of the plane. Murmurs followed in her wake. Curiosity, judgment, and hushed speculation trailing behind her like whispers on the wind. Lillian took her new seat without complaint, gazing out the window with the same calm composure as before. At the front, Rachel straightened her uniform and returned to her duties, relieved to have resolved the matter. She had no idea what had just been set in motion. As the plane's engines hummed to life, the whispers died down, replaced by the clicking of seat belts and the sound of overhead bins latching shut. Rachel stood tall, her professional facade intact, unaware that the flight ahead would hold more lessons than she ever anticipated. Rachel Dawson moved through the cabin with the air of authority flight attendants often adopted during safety demonstrations. Her earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by a cool professionalism, though beneath it lingered a flicker of satisfaction. As Rachel stood at the front of the plane, her gaze drifted briefly to the rear, where Lillian Hayes now sat. Lillian's posture remained upright, hands lightly resting in her lap, her expression unreadable. There was no sign of discomfort, no resentment, just an unsettling stillness that seemed to command attention. At the front of the cabin, the man in the charcoal suit reclined slightly in his seat. Though his eyes rarely lingered for long, every so often his glance flickered toward the back of the plane. His expression betrayed nothing, but something about his presence carried weight. Passengers whispered softly, stealing curious glances at him. Theories spread quietly. Was he a political figure? A high-powered executive? His calm demeanor and deliberate movements only deepened the speculation. As Rachel continued her duties, she passed near his row. His hand lifted slightly, a subtle yet commanding gesture. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and composed. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" Rachel straightened, snapping back to the professionalism she knew well. "Of course, sir," she replied, her tone deferential, as she hurried toward the galley. While pouring the water, Rachel's eyes wandered toward the back of the plane once more. Her curiosity gnawed at her. Something about Lillian unsettled her, though she couldn't place why. Returning with the glass, Rachel approached the man and handed it to him. "Thank you," he said with a polite nod. Just as Rachel was about to step away, his voice stopped her. "The woman you asked to move earlier," he said casually, gesturing subtly with his glass toward the rear. "What happened there?" Rachel's pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder, ensuring no passengers were within earshot. "Oh, it was nothing," she said lightly. She seemed a bit confused about her seat. "I thought it best to avoid any inconvenience." The man's lips curved into the faintest smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "Confused?" he repeated, his tone soft but carrying an edge. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, sir. Just a small misunderstanding," she replied, though her confidence faltered slightly. The man nodded slowly, as if turning her words over in his mind. "Interesting," he murmured, the hint of amusement, or perhaps something sharper, lingering beneath the word. Rachel hesitated for a moment longer before excusing herself, retreating quickly to the galley with a lingering unease that hadn't been there before. At the back of the plane, Lillian remained composed. Her gaze drifted out the window as the plane taxied toward the runway, though her mind was alert. She could feel the faint echoes of curiosity and judgment circling her, but she gave no outward sign of noticing. Her quiet demeanor held a subtle weight. As the plane roared to life, accelerating down the runway, Lillian's eyes closed briefly. The familiar sensation of liftoff sent a gentle hum through the cabin, and she exhaled softly. She felt the eyes, passengers, the flight attendant, and most notably, the man in the charcoal suit. Each glance lingered like a question yet to be answered. The seatbelt sign dimmed, and the cabin relaxed as conversations resumed. Beverage carts rattled down the aisles. Rachel returned to her duties, though the ease she typically carried had begun to fray. Her movements were precise but less fluid, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. At the front, the man's attention appeared to drift between his phone and the window, but every few minutes, his gaze inevitably found its way toward the back. His expression grew darker as the subtle glances from other passengers hadn't escaped his notice. He said nothing, but there was no mistaking it. He had observed everything. Rachel avoided eye contact as she passed by Lillian's row, but Lillian's calm gaze followed her for just a fraction longer than necessary. She wasn't confrontational, but the weight of her presence seemed to hang in Rachel's peripheral vision like a shadow. Lillian didn't need to speak. Her silence had become louder than any protest. A brief jolt of turbulence rippled through the cabin, drawing quiet gasps from a few nervous passengers. Lillian's fingers instinctively tightened on the armrest for a heartbeat before she relaxed once more. Across the aisle, a woman seated nearby leaned closer, her voice soft but curious. "Excuse me," she began hesitantly, her eyes flicking toward Lillian. "I couldn't help but notice, earlier with the seat thing, it felt unnecessary." Lillian turned to her, her smile faint but understanding. "Sometimes," Lillian said evenly, "people make assumptions." Her words were simple, but they settled in the air with quiet weight. The woman nodded slowly, her cheeks reddening slightly. "Well, I just thought you handled it gracefully. I'm not sure I would've." Lillian offered a slight nod in acknowledgement, but said nothing more. The woman turned back to her seat, though the brief exchange left an impression, one that lingered long after the conversation ended. Unbeknownst to Rachel, the man in the charcoal suit had risen from his seat at the front. His steps were unhurried as he casually strolled down the aisle, pausing briefly at the rows near Lillian. His eyes softened slightly as he caught her gaze. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with familiarity. Lillian's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone warm but calm. It was a brief moment, but it ignited murmurs once more. Who was this man? And more importantly, who exactly was Lillian Hayes? "You handled it with such grace." "I'm not sure I could have," the woman across the aisle said softly, admiration in her tone. Lillian Hayes gave a small nod of thanks but said nothing more. The exchange, brief as it was, left an imprint. The woman turned back to her book, her brow furrowed in quiet reflection. Unnoticed by Rachel Dawson, the man in the charcoal suit rose from his seat at the front of the cabin. His movements were unhurried, casual, like a passenger stretching his legs. Yet there was an air of quiet intention as he strolled down the aisle. His eyes swept over the rows until they settled on Lillian. A faint smile touched his lips, subtle but warm, carrying a mixture of familiarity and something deeper, something resolute. As he approached, heads turned, tracking him with the same curiosity that had followed him when he boarded. The man paused beside Lillian's row, bending slightly to meet her gaze. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with concern. Lillian looked up at him, her expression softening. A quiet smile played on her lips. "I'm fine," she replied evenly. It was a brief exchange, but it lit a spark among nearby passengers. Whispers fluttered through the cabin like leaves caught in a breeze. Who was this man? Rachel, adjusting a tray near the front, glanced up just in time to see him. She froze, her eyes widening as the pieces slowly began to fit together. A ripple of anxiety worked its way through her as she watched the man speak with Lillian. Rachel's fingers tightened on the edge of the service cart. The earlier satisfaction she'd felt now dissolving into something colder. Unease. Her gaze lingered on the interaction, the closeness between them. The way he bent toward Lillian, his voice low but familiar, unsettled her. Who is he? Rachel quickly turned away, forcing herself to focus on her tasks, but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. The man straightened, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. His gaze flickered over the nearby passengers, lingering just long enough for them to feel it. There was no mistaking the quiet authority in his demeanor. "If you need anything," he said to Lillian, his voice just loud enough for those seated nearby to hear, "let me know." With that, he turned and walked back toward the front of the plane. His strides were slow but deliberate, and his return to his seat did nothing to dispel the whispers that now hummed steadily through the cabin. Passengers exchanged hushed theories. Maybe he's her boss. Maybe they're family. Whoever he is, he didn't look pleased. Rachel, now hyper-aware of every glance, felt the weight of their curiosity pressing down on her. She gripped the handle of the cart tighter than necessary, retreating to the galley in search of quiet, though she found none. At the rear of the plane, Lillian sat poised, gazing quietly out the window. If the murmurs reached her, she gave no sign. A flicker of satisfaction crossed her features. a quiet acknowledgement that the tide was beginning to turn. She adjusted her seatbelt with graceful precision, as if preparing for something. The man returned to his seat in first class and settled in. Though he said nothing, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers who had previously shown mild interest now exchanged knowing glances, sensing they were witnessing something larger than it appeared. Rachel's attempt at reprieve in the galley was brief. She poured drinks with stiff, mechanical movements, her focus shaken. As she worked, the cockpit door opened slightly, and the co-pilot stepped into the space, leaning casually against the counter. "Busy day?" he asked, his tone light. Rachel nodded quickly, not trusting her voice to sound steady. "Just the usual," she replied, her words clipped. The co-pilot studied her for a moment, then his expression shifted, his smile fading slightly. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "I couldn't help but notice earlier, the woman you asked to move." Rachel's stomach dropped. She glanced at him sharply, her defenses rising. "What about it?" she asked, her tone edged. The co-pilot shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Not really my business," he said, though his eyes lingered on her. "But she's not just any passenger." Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do you mean?" she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. The co-pilot glanced toward the front of the plane, his gaze settling on the man in the charcoal suit. "You'll figure it out soon enough," he said simply, pushing off the counter and disappearing back into the cockpit. Rachel stood frozen, her mind spinning as she tried to piece everything together. Lillian's gaze lingered on the view outside the window, a reflection faint against the clouds. Her expression softened, but her thoughts remained sharp. She had long learned that patience was a powerful tool. Now, she could feel the weight of the moment building, the quiet storm Rachel had unknowingly stirred, preparing to unfold. The engines hummed steadily, the sky stretching endlessly ahead. Lillian leaned back into her seat, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Lillian Hayes continued gazing out at the clouds, her expression calm as if the swirling tension in the cabin didn't exist. The hum of the engines softened the distant whispers, but the curiosity of the passengers had grown palpable. Rachel Dawson moved mechanically, her hands trembling as she prepared drinks in the galley. The weight of the co-pilot's words and the man's lingering gaze pressed against her chest. She forced herself to focus, but her mind replayed the interaction over and over. At the front of the cabin, the man in the charcoal suit, Noah Hayes, appeared relaxed, sipping from a glass as he scrolled through his phone. But every so often, his gaze drifted toward the rear of the plane, his face unreadable. Rachel's stomach twisted with unease each time his eyes shifted. Passengers continued their hushed speculations. "Did you see how he looked at her?" one murmured. "They must know each other. Maybe he's someone important." The whispers only fueled Rachel's anxiety. Suddenly, the chime of a call light pierced the air. Rachel glanced up and froze. Noah's light was on. She instinctively stepped forward, but another flight attendant nearby started toward his seat. Noah raised a hand, stopping them with a small but deliberate gesture. "I'd prefer to speak with her," he said, his voice calm yet firm, as he nodded toward Rachel, her heart hammered in her chest. Straightening her uniform, Rachel walked toward him, forcing a polite smile that felt painfully thin. "How can I assist you, sir?" she asked, her voice betraying the slight tremble she tried to suppress. Noah studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Finally, he gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Sit down," he said quietly. Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not allowed to." "It's important," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Rachel sank into the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A few nearby passengers leaned slightly closer, subtly eavesdropping. Noah leaned forward, his voice low but heavy with weight. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his eyes locked onto hers. Rachel swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm not sure, sir," she stammered. His lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "I'm Noah Hayes," he said evenly. "I'm the CEO of this airline." Rachel's breath hitched. Her face paled as realization sank in. Her mind scrambled, replaying the moments leading up to this, the casual dismissal, the assumptions, the insistence that Lillian move to the back of the plane. Noah's gaze didn't waver. "The woman you asked to move," he continued, each word cutting through the air with precision, "is my wife." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart pounded so fiercely she was sure the passengers nearby could hear it. I didn't realize, she stammered, gripping the hem of her apron tightly. Noah raised a hand, silencing her immediately. That's the problem, he said coldly. You didn't realize because you didn't care to look past your assumptions. Rachel's throat tightened, and she blinked rapidly to hold back the sting of tears. The cabin around them had grown eerily silent, passengers straining to catch pieces of the conversation. Those seated nearby exchanged wide-eyed glances. You're fortunate that my wife is more gracious than most, Noah continued, his tone softening only slightly. But understand this isn't something I can overlook. Rachel's gaze fell to her lap, shame burning hot against her skin. I'm deeply sorry, sir, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah's expression remained impassive, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. Without another word, he rose from his seat, signaling the conversation was over. Rachel sat frozen for a moment, her head spinning, before she quietly excused herself and returned to the galley. Each step felt heavier than the last, the whispers of the passengers trailing behind her like shadows. In the back of the plane, Lillian watched the clouds drift by, unbothered by the growing storm Rachel had created. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know exactly how it had unfolded. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth as Noah returned to his seat. No words were exchanged between them. They didn't need to be. Lillian's quiet grace had done more to shift the balance than any confrontation ever could. Rachel remained in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter as she poured water she had no intention of drinking. Her thoughts spiraled endlessly. How could I have missed it? Her breath came in shallow bursts, and she leaned against the counter, hoping no one would notice the tears threatening to spill. Back in her seat, Lillian sat with the same poise and composure she'd carried all along. Her focus remained on the sky beyond the window, unaffected by the drama still buzzing in the cabin. But for the passengers seated nearby, the story had shifted. Whispers continued, though now the tone was different, tinged with awe and embarrassment. A man seated across the aisle couldn't contain his curiosity. Leaning slightly toward Lillian, he cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly, his voice low. "I just wanted to say, it's remarkable how calm you've been through all of this." Lillian turned toward him, her expression soft yet steady. "Thank you," she replied, her voice warm but reserved. The man hesitated for a moment longer. "You're his wife, aren't you?" he asked quietly. Lillian gave a slight nod. "I am." The man shook his head in disbelief. "And you didn't say anything when she asked you to move," he pressed. Lillian's gaze shifted toward the window once more, her hands resting lightly in her lap. "There's more power in silence," she said simply. "Sometimes letting others reveal who they are speaks louder than words." The man sat back, his expression thoughtful. "You're a better person than most," he said softly, almost to himself. Lillian smiled faintly but said nothing more. Lillian Hayes's gaze lingered on the clouds outside the window, the soft hum of the engines creating a peaceful contrast to the tension that quietly rippled through the cabin. Across the aisle, the man who had spoken to her earlier, Daniel Reed, sat back, his expression thoughtful as he mulled over Lillian's words. Her calm, unwavering demeanor left an impression, though she seemed unaffected by the attention she garnered. In the galley, Rachel Dawson emerged hesitantly, a tray of drinks balanced in her hands. Her steps lacked their usual confidence. The composure she once wore like armor now felt thin, fragile. As she approached Lillian's row, her hand faltered. For a moment, Rachel stood frozen, torn between duty and the weight of what had transpired. Lillian glanced up, her expression unreadable, meeting Rachel's hesitant gaze with a quiet steadiness. The silence that stretched between them felt heavier than words. Finally, Rachel managed to find her voice. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. Lillian regarded her for a long moment before giving a small nod, her voice soft but firm. "I hope you've learned something." The words, though gentle, cut through the air like glass. Rachel's breath hitched, and she nodded quickly, blinking away the tears threatening to spill. Without another word, she turned and hurried down the aisle, leaving Lillian to return to her quiet contemplation. Up in first class, Noah Hayes sat with his phone in hand, calmly responding to emails as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. His expression betrayed no lingering frustration, only focus, as if the earlier confrontation had already been categorized and filed away. A flight attendant approached, her voice hesitant. "Is there anything I can get you, Mr. Hayes?" Noah glanced up with a polite smile. "No, thank you," he replied, returning his attention to his phone. He didn't need to say more. For the remainder of the flight, an air of quiet reflection settled over the cabin. Passengers, now fully aware of who Noah and Lillian were, exchanged brief glances, but few dared to speak aloud. Lillian remained poised, as she had from the beginning, graceful, serene, and seemingly untouched by the day's events. In the rear of the plane, Rachel busied herself with menial tasks, avoiding eye contact with Lillian as she passed by. The weight of Noah's words echoed in her mind. "You didn't realize because you didn't care to look past your assumptions." Her usual confidence dissolved into a hesitant, almost timid stride. A young woman seated a few rows ahead whispered to her companion. "She's his wife," the woman murmured, her eyes flicking toward Lillian. "The CEO's wife." Her companion shook her head. "And the flight attendant made her move to the back," she replied softly. "I'd be mortified." Lillian heard the murmurs but chose not to react. She shifted slightly in her seat, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the tray table. Her mind remained calm, vigilant. She didn't need to explain herself. She never did. Up front, Noah's eyes occasionally scanned the cabin, observing passengers with deliberate precision. His gaze settled on Rachel once or twice, watching as she moved with careful restraint. It wasn't cruelty that kept him silent. It was deliberate. He had always admired that about Lillian, her ability to command attention without confrontation, to turn discomfort into a quiet lesson. Rachel's steps eventually led her back to Lillian's row. She paused as she delivered drinks to another passenger, but her gaze lingered on Lillian, filled with something more than mere obligation. It was remorse. Rachel tightened her grip on the tray and took a quiet breath. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've already apologized, but I need to say it again. I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you. It was wrong. I see that now." Lillian slowly lifted her gaze, calm as ever. For a moment she said nothing, allowing the weight of Rachel's words to settle in the space between them. Finally, Lillian spoke, her tone even but purposeful. "Do you understand why it was wrong?" Rachel's eyes flickered with hesitation, her breath catching. Yes," she said quickly. "I judged you based on assumptions. I acted without thinking, and She swallowed hard. "I won't let it happen again." Lillian's gaze softened slightly, though her composure remained steady. "Apologies are a start," she said gently, "but change is what matters." Rachel nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears she fought to hold back. "I will," she promised. As Rachel stepped away, her steps felt a little heavier, weighted not by guilt, but by the understanding that she carried a lesson that would linger long after the flight landed. In first class, Noah checked his watch as the flight neared its descent. His gaze naturally drifted toward Lillian, sitting calmly in the back, as composed as she had been since the moment she boarded. A faint smile tugged at his lips. She had handled everything exactly as he knew she would, with quiet grace and a strength that left an undeniable mark on everyone around her. The captain's voice announced their approach, breaking the hush that had settled over the cabin. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and preparing for arrival. But for Rachel, Lillian, and Noah, the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Lillian Hayes tucked her book away as the plane began its descent, the clouds below parting to reveal the sprawl of city lights glittering beneath the soft hues of sunset. Her hands moved with calm precision, fastening her seatbelt without hurry. Across the cabin, Noah Hayes caught her eye for a brief moment. He didn't need to say anything. Lillian felt his presence, steady and unwavering, like she always did. Rachel Dawson adjusted her uniform at the front of the plane, trying to focus as the captain's voice echoed through the speakers. She moved stiffly through the cabin, rehearsing her disembarkation script in her head, but the quiet words Lillian had spoken earlier pressed heavily on her mind. Apologies are a start, but change is what matters. Passengers began shifting in their seats, closing laptops and tucking away novels. A quiet hum of activity spread across the cabin, but it didn't dissolve the undercurrent of reflection that lingered. Lillian gazed out the window as the plane dipped lower, slicing through soft clouds. She didn't need to glance around to feel the weight of passing glances. Up front, Noah signaled to a nearby flight attendant, one of the younger crew members. Rachel watched from a distance as the woman responded with quick eagerness, leaning close as Noah spoke quietly to her. She nodded, disappearing toward the cockpit. Rachel's stomach tightened. She couldn't hear what Noah said, but the ease of his authority unsettled her. She hadn't yet felt the full consequence of her actions, but something in the air whispered that it was coming. As the wheels touched down, gently easing onto the runway, the spell over the cabin began to lift. The ordinary sounds of travel, the rustle of bags, the quiet clicks of seatbelts releasing, filled the space. For many, the flight was over. But Rachel knew the weight of this journey would follow her long after the passengers stepped off. When the plane came to a complete stop and the signal for disembarking was given, Rachel took her position at the front, hands gripping the back of a nearby seat as first-class passengers gathered their things. Noah Hayes stood, his broad frame moving with quiet confidence as he retrieved his briefcase. A few words passed between him and another passenger, his voice low but polite. Rachel held her breath as he approached. No glance, no acknowledgement. His stride alone was enough to send a shiver down her spine. As Noah passed, Rachel's gaze followed him toward the rear of the plane. There, Lillian sat patiently, her posture relaxed but graceful as she waited for the row ahead to clear. When Noah reached her, the tension that had lingered around him softened. His smile, rare and warm, appeared as he extended a hand. "Ready?" he asked gently. Lillian's lips curved into a small knowing smile as she placed her hand in his. She rose with effortless grace, and together they moved down the aisle, side by side, unbothered by the soft murmurs trailing behind them. Rachel's chest tightened as they passed. Lillian's gaze flickered to her, offering nothing more than a brief, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, barely anything at all. Yet Rachel felt it sink deeper than any formal reprimand could. Noah's attention never wavered from Lillian as they stepped through the open door and disappeared into the terminal. Their presence lingered, even as the cabin gradually emptied, leaving Rachel alone at the front. For her, the flight wasn't just over. It left a mark. She stood at her post, her smile forced as she thanked the remaining passengers with quiet professionalism. But the glance of each traveler felt heavier, as though carrying silent judgment. Row by row, the cabin emptied until Rachel found herself alone in the aisle. The emptiness mirrored something inside her, a stark reminder of what she had overlooked. In the back of the plane, Lillian gathered her belongings without hurry. Noah waited just ahead, his presence grounding her as she moved with her usual calm. As Lillian passed her seat, she glanced at it briefly, her expression unreadable. A fleeting smile crossed her lips, small, reflective. Noah caught the subtle change in her face as she stepped closer. "What's on your mind?" he asked softly, tilting his head toward her. Lillian looked up at him, eyes calm but distant. "People," she replied simply, "and the choices they make." Noah nodded knowingly, placing his hand lightly over hers as they stepped into the terminal. Outside the gate, the world bustled with the usual energy of travelers, but neither of them paid it any mind. As they walked through the terminal together, whispers followed, but Lillian paid them no attention. Her lesson wasn't loud or overt, it was quiet, subtle. And Rachel Dawson would carry that silence far longer than the noise of the airport around her. Row by row, the plane emptied, but Rachel Dawson lingered at the front. Her smile felt stiff, her posture unnaturally rigid as she thanked passengers for flying with Aurora Airlines. Each glance from those departing seemed to linger a little longer, brief but weighted. Even without words, Rachel felt their unspoken judgment, a soft but persistent hum in the air, like the sting of tiny needles beneath her skin. She silently wished for the flight to be over, but somehow, time seemed to stretch endlessly. At the rear of the plane, Lillian Hayes rose with her usual grace. She gathered her belongings with a quiet precision that felt almost deliberate, as if every movement were part of a silent statement. Noah Hayes stood patiently beside her, his presence grounding her amidst the subtle hum of passengers still shuffling through the aisles. As Lillian slipped the strap of her handbag over her shoulder, She turned, her eyes lingering briefly on the seat she'd occupied for the majority of the flight. A small smile brushed her lips, fleeting, almost imperceptible. But it carried weight. Noah noticed. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so that no one else could hear. "What's on your mind?" Lillian's gaze remained distant for a moment longer before shifting to meet his. Her expression was calm, but something deeper flickered beneath the surface. "Just thinking," she replied softly, "about people and the choices they make." Noah nodded knowingly, offering his arm. Lillian placed her hand lightly on his as they moved toward the front. The cabin was nearly empty now, save for a few stragglers still retrieving their bags from overhead bins. Those who remained couldn't help but steal glances as the couple passed. Lillian and Noah ignored the quiet curiosity that followed them. Together they moved in quiet unison, a silent shield against the lingering gazes. Rachel felt the shift in the air long before the couple reached her. Her heart pounded as they approached, the weight of their presence thickening with every step. She had rehearsed the apology a dozen times in her mind, but now, face to face with Lillian, every word she'd practiced felt flimsy and insincere. By the time they stood in front of her, Rachel thought she might faint under the pressure. Lillian's eyes met hers, calm, steady. Rachel opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Mrs. Hayes." She swallowed thickly, her cheeks burning. "I just wanted to say how deeply sorry I am. For everything. For how I treated you." Noah remained silent beside Lillian, his gaze fixed on Rachel with quiet intensity. Lillian tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing in quiet thought. "Do you know what you're apologizing for, Rachel?" Her voice was soft, but it cut through the noise of the terminal beyond the cabin like a blade. Rachel's stomach knotted. She blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yes, ma'am," she stammered quickly. I shouldn't have judged you. I made assumptions. I treated you unfairly. It was unprofessional, and I was wrong." Lillian held Rachel's gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing the sincerity in her words. Finally, she gave a small nod. "It's not just about professionalism," Lillian said quietly. "It's about respect, and that's something we owe to everyone, no matter what we think we know about them." Rachel's throat tightened, tears welled in her eyes, but she fought to keep them at bay. "I understand," Rachel said, her voice cracking. "I truly do, and I promise I'll do better." For the first time, Lillian's expression softened. "Good," she replied simply. "I hope you do." Rachel exhaled a shaky breath of relief. Noah, who had remained silent, finally spoke. His voice was low and calm, but it carried unmistakable authority. "Rachel, my wife has given you more grace than most would," he said, his gaze steady. "Take this as an opportunity to learn and grow. Not everyone is willing to teach through kindness." Rachel nodded quickly, eyes lowered. "Yes, sir. Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah didn't respond. Together, he and Lillian stepped past her, disappearing into the jet bridge. As the door closed behind them, the soft murmurs of speculation from the terminal began to swell. Passengers who had been silent throughout the flight now exchanged hushed conversations, their whispers chasing after the couple as they moved through the bustling crowd. But neither Lillian nor Noah seemed to notice. Their strides were steady, unbothered by the quiet stir their presence left in their wake. A sleek black car waited just beyond the gate. A driver stepped forward to greet them, opening the door. Noah helped Lillian inside before slipping in beside her. As the doors shut and the hum of the airport faded behind them, Noah reached for Lillian's hand, his fingers brushing lightly over hers. "You handled that beautifully," he said softly, admiration evident in his tone. Lillian smiled, her eyes meeting his. "Sometimes people need to see their own actions reflected back at them," she replied. "It's the only way they'll understand." Noah nodded, his thumb grazing her hand gently. "True," he said, "but it takes strength to respond with grace instead of anger." Lillian's gaze shifted to the city skyline as it came into view, glittering against the early evening sky. She didn't hold on to resentment. It wasn't in her nature. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that the lessons of the day had left a mark, not just on Rachel Dawson, but on every passenger who had witnessed what had unfolded. As the car glided through the city streets, Lillian leaned into Noah's side, her hand still resting gently in his. The golden light of evening poured over the city as the car weaved through the bustling streets. Lillian Hayes rested her head lightly against the seat, her gaze drifting over the world beyond the tinted glass. Her expression was serene, but her thoughts lingered on the events of the flight. The subtle but powerful confrontation that had taken place at 30,000 feet. Lillian wondered about Rachel Dawson, the flight attendant whose assumptions had unraveled in front of a plane full of passengers. Would she remember the lesson, or would it fade into the blur of routine, diluted by the rush of daily life? Noah, seated beside her, seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts. Without a word, he reached over, his fingers gently brushing hers before clasping them together. "She'll remember," Noah said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. His tone was steady, carrying the quiet confidence Lillian had grown to admire over the years. Lillian glanced at him, a faint smile curving her lips. "You think so?" Noah nodded, his eyes fixed ahead. "Moments like that don't just disappear. They leave marks. Maybe small, maybe life-changing. But they stay. She'll carry it with her." Lillian considered his words, her gaze lingering on him. His calm certainty balanced her quiet strength in a way that felt effortless. She squeezed his hand gently, letting his words settle over her like a soft blanket. As the car turned into the circular driveway of a sleek, modern building, its glass facade shimmered under the city lights. The driver stepped out, moving swiftly to open the door for Noah. He stepped out first, offering his hand to Lillian. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement as she exited the car, taking in the peaceful stillness of their surroundings. This wasn't their home, but one of Noah's private offices, a place he used for meetings away from the formality of his corporate headquarters. Inside, the atmosphere was cool and calm, the soft hum of air conditioning the only sound as they were led into a private lounge. The room exuded quiet luxury. Plush seating circled a low table where a tray of refreshments awaited, alongside a sleek black folder bearing the golden emblem of Aurora Airlines. Noah gestured for Lillian to sit before lowering himself beside her. "I had this prepared earlier," he said, tapping the folder lightly. "I wanted to go over it with you before moving forward." Lillian raised an eyebrow, curiosity sparking in her eyes. She opened the folder, scanning the neatly organized pages. The contents revealed an internal report, surveys, employee feedback, and detailed accounts of customer experiences. As her eyes moved down the pages, patterns began to emerge. Complaints about service inconsistencies, instances of unconscious bias, small but telling cracks in the foundation of the company's culture. "It's systemic," Lillian remarked, closing the folder with a quiet thud. She looked up at Noah, her eyes sharp. "This isn't just about Rachel or one flight attendant. It's a culture that lets these assumptions take root." Noah nodded, his expression serious. "Exactly. And that's why I wanted your input. You see things others miss." Lillian leaned back slightly, her fingertips tracing the edge of the folder. "It's not enough to handle isolated incidents," she said thoughtfully. "You'll need to go deeper, change how employees are trained, how they interact with people. Respect can't just be written in a handbook, it has to be part of the culture." Noah watched her, his admiration quietly evident. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," he admitted, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've already scheduled a meeting with the executive team. I want you there." Lillian blinked, surprised. "Me? Who else?" Noah replied, leaning forward slightly. "You're the best example of what I want this company to reflect. Your grace, your strength, how you handled today, it's exactly the kind of leadership I want our team to embody. You don't just speak about respect, Lillian. You live it." Warmth bloomed in Lillian's chest, a mix of pride and humility. She hadn't expected this, but as she looked into Noah's eyes, she saw sincerity and trust. He wasn't asking as her husband, he was asking her as a partner, as someone who could help shape something lasting. Lillian nodded slowly, a soft smile playing at her lips. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." Noah's relief was almost palpable. "Thank you," he said quietly. For a while they sat in silence, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the wide lounge windows. It was a quiet but meaningful pause, a shared moment of reflection and the start of something new. Lillian felt the weight of the day begin to lift, replaced by a quiet but powerful sense of purpose. The lesson from the flight wouldn't remain confined to those cabin walls. It would ripple outward, beyond Rachel Dawson and the passengers who had witnessed it, throughout the company, and perhaps further than either of them could yet imagine. As they left the lounge and stepped back into the car, Lillian felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that change was possible, even in the smallest moments. And beside her, Noah remained the steady force he had always been, her partner not just in life, but in purpose. Together, they were ready to turn the spark of that lesson into something far greater. Morning sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Noah's private conference room, casting a soft glow over the polished table at its center. Lillian Hayes stood by the glass, gazing down at the bustling city below. The distant hum of traffic and the faint murmur of office staff created a quiet rhythm of anticipation. Today wasn't just another meeting. It was an opportunity, one that had been forged thousands of feet in the air. Lillian felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, not with apprehension, but with a sense of quiet resolve. This wasn't about corporate policies or surface-level adjustments. It was about addressing something deeper, a systemic thread that had surfaced during their flight the day before. Behind her, the door opened softly. Noah stepped in, a cup of coffee in one hand, a thick folder tucked under his arm. He paused just inside the room, taking a moment to watch her in the sunlight. "Are you nervous?" His voice carried the warmth of a gentle tease. Lillian glanced over her shoulder, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Not nervous," she replied. "Just thinking." Noah placed the coffee and folder down before coming to stand beside her. "About what?" She shifted her gaze back to the skyline, her expression thoughtful. "Change. How it starts. It's not easy and rarely comfortable," she said quietly. "But if it's done right, it sticks." Noah nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. "That's exactly why you're here. You see things clearly, and you have the courage to say what needs to be said. That's what this company needs." Before long, the door opened again as the members of the executive team began filing in. Their chatter was subdued as they settled into their seats. Some glanced toward Lillian, is polite but curious. Others exchanged the usual pleasantries with Noah, though there was a clear undercurrent of curiosity about why she was there. When the last seat was filled, Noah rose, his presence at the head of the table commanding quiet attention. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone calm but firm. "Today's meeting isn't about quarterly reports or operational targets. It's about something far more important, our culture. How we define it, how we live it, and how we fall short." His eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on each person. "Yesterday, Lillian and I experienced something during one of our flights that made it clear this conversation can't wait any longer," Noah continued. "The way passengers and employees interact isn't just about following guidelines. It's about fostering respect and dignity at every level." A hush fell over the table. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded thoughtfully. Noah gestured to Lillian with a small nod. "Many of you know Lillian as my wife, but today I want you to hear from her as someone who witnessed firsthand why this issue matters." Lillian rose with quiet poise, the confidence in her posture drawing attention without effort. Her eyes briefly met those of several executives as she began. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," she said, her tone steady but warm. "I'm not here to criticize or assign blame. I'm here to share a perspective, a reminder of how powerful respect can be and how damaging its absence is." With careful precision, she recounted the flight. The subtle dismissiveness, the assumptions that had shaped Rachel Dawson's behavior. Lillian's words were measured, devoid of anger or malice, but they carried a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. She explained how moments like that, if left unaddressed, didn't just affect individuals. They could seep into the very foundation of a company's culture, undermining trust, fostering resentment, and creating an invisible divide between employees and those they serve. "It's not enough to simply train employees to follow procedures," Lillian said, her voice carrying through the room. "We need to teach empathy. We need to encourage awareness. And we need to hold each other accountable, especially when we fall short." By the time she finished, the room was wrapped in silence. Noah stepped forward, his expression resolute. "Lillian is right," he said, his gaze sweeping the room once more. We cannot allow complacency or unchecked assumptions to shape our culture. Starting today, we'll begin reevaluating how we train our employees, redefine our core values, and set higher standards for everyone, ourselves included. His eyes narrowed, focusing on a few senior team members seated toward the center. I expect each of you to lead by example, he continued. This isn't just about words on paper, it's about living those values every day. Some executives nodded with quiet enthusiasm. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but the message was clear. Change wasn't optional. As the meeting concluded, several executives approached Lillian, offering quiet words of thanks and support. She accepted each with grace, but deep down she knew the hardest work was still ahead. When the last person left the room, Noah turned to her. His expression softened, pride flickering behind his eyes. "You were incredible," he said, his voice low. Lillian smiled, her humility tempering the praise. "This is just the start. Real change, that'll take time." Noah nodded, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I know, but today was a step in the right direction." Together they exited the room, ready to transform the company from the inside out, one small but meaningful shift at a time. Precision and accountability became the cornerstones of the change Lillian and Noah Hayes set in motion. Together, they worked behind the scenes, their professional partnership as seamless as their personal one. The first major step was overhauling employee training. Rachel Dawson's actions during the flight were not singled out as a punishment, but became a pivotal case study, one that highlighted unconscious bias and the transformative power of humility. The training wasn't the standard corporate presentation. It was immersive, rooted in real stories, like Lillian's, designed to reinforce that respect and empathy weren't optional. They were essential. Lillian wasn't content to simply oversee the rollout. She sat alongside flight attendants, gate agents, and ground crew members, participating as an equal, not as a figurehead. Her quiet but steady presence brought a unique energy to the sessions. Employees who might have otherwise tuned out found themselves captivated by the sincerity in her voice and the weight of her words. One session in particular stood out. Held in a modest training room at a regional hub far from the sleek halls of corporate headquarters, the room was filled with employees, many of whom had never met Noah or Lillian in person. Rachel Dawson sat near the back. Her posture was stiff, but her eyes never left Lillian. She had requested to attend, not out of obligation, but as a step toward redemption. The trainer, a seasoned expert in workplace culture, opened the session, eventually introducing Lillian and inviting her to speak. As Lillian rose, the atmosphere shifted. Her poise filled the space effortlessly, a warmth in her demeanor that softened the room's edges. "I want to thank you for being here," Lillian began, her voice even but kind. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. "What I hope you'll take away today," she continued, "is that every interaction you have, whether with a passenger, a colleague, or a stranger, carries weight. Respect isn't just policy, it's personal, and it lingers long after the moment has passed." The room hung on her words. Lillian spoke of the flight, recounting the experience without bitterness or blame. "I'm not here to dwell on mistakes," she said. "We all make them. What defines us is how we respond, and how we grow from them." Rachel shifted in her seat, visibly moved. Lillian's words resonated deeply, echoing in the quiet room. As Lillian opened the floor for questions, there was a brief hesitation. Then, one by one, hands rose. The space buzzed with conversation. Flight attendants shared stories of their own experiences, misunderstandings, assumptions, and moments they wished they could redo. Lillian listened, encouraging open dialogue and fostering solutions that could be implemented moving forward. By the end, a line formed at the front of the room. Employees waited to speak with her personally, their gratitude evident in every word and handshake. Rachel waited until the room had mostly emptied. Approaching slowly, she clasped her hands tightly in front of her, her voice trembling slightly as she began. "Mrs. Hayes, I just wanted to say thank you, not only for forgiving me, but for everything you've done since that flight. You didn't have to, but you did." Lillian regarded her for a moment. Then, with a soft but knowing smile, she replied, "You're here. That tells me you've already started to grow. Keep going." Rachel's eyes welled with tears. "I will," she promised. As Rachel stepped away, Noah entered the room, having caught the tail end of the session. He leaned casually against the doorway, watching as employees lingered in small groups, energized by the session. "You're making waves," he said, his voice low but filled with admiration. Lillian smiled, a playful glint in her eye. "Maybe, but it's not about me," she replied. "They're the ones who have to carry this forward." Noah wrapped an arm around her waist as they walked toward the exit. "True," he agreed, "but they wouldn't be doing it without you." Their presence didn't go unnoticed. As they moved through the hub, employees exchanged glances, some curious, others appreciative. The quiet ripple of change had already begun. Later that evening, Noah and Lillian sat together on the balcony of their home, glasses of wine in hand. The city lights flickered below, casting a warm glow over the horizon. Noah raised his glass. "To the quiet revolution," he said with a smile. Lillian laughed softly, clinking her glass against his. "To respect and dignity," she added, "and the courage it takes to make them real." The night air grew cooler, but the warmth between them remained. They sat in silence, content in the knowledge that the journey of change had only just begun. Step by step, moment by moment, until the ripples became a tide. In the months that followed, the airline underwent a transformation. What began as a single incident in the sky had become a movement, shifting not just policies but hearts and minds. The story of Lillian's quiet dignity and Noah's steadfast leadership spread far beyond the company walls. It found its way into leadership seminars, training modules, and viral posts on social media. For Noah and Lillian, it was never about recognition. It was about the unseen, lasting impact, one life, one lesson at a time. The shifts in policy were just the beginning. Lillian and Noah Hayes watched as attitudes and behaviors across the airline began to transform. Their story, Lillian's quiet dignity and Noah's steady leadership, became more than an anecdote. It evolved into a cornerstone of the airline's cultural training, spreading far beyond the corporate walls. But for them, it was never about viral stories or public praise. It was about creating lasting change, one interaction at a time. At the heart of this transformation was a new initiative called the Empathy Initiative. Lillian spearheaded the program, with Noah's executive backing, ensuring its reach. The initiative focused on empathy, cultural awareness, and active listening, core elements designed to rebuild trust and foster a culture of respect across every level of the airline. Rather than dictating policies, the program aimed to inspire. Lillian worked alongside a diverse team, curating workshops, organizing discussion panels, and establishing mentorship programs. One of the most pivotal moments came during the airline's annual employee summit. Held at a sprawling convention center, the conference welcomed thousands of staff, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, executives, and administrative personnel. The energy in the room was electric. Lillian, now a quiet symbol of the airline's new direction, was the keynote speaker. As she stepped onto the stage, the room erupted in applause. She stood tall, her presence poised yet approachable. When the applause faded, she began. "Thank you," Lillian said, her voice warm but steady. "It's humbling to stand here today, but I want to make something clear. This isn't about me. It's about us. Every single one of us. It's about how we choose to treat each other, how we show up, and how we choose to see the world." Her words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. "When I think about respect," Lillian continued, "I don't think about grand gestures or complicated policies. I think about small moments. The moments where we choose kindness, where we choose to listen. These moments might feel insignificant at the time, but trust me, they're the foundation for something far greater." As she spoke, Lillian recounted the events of that flight, not as a personal vindication, but as a lesson. Rachel Dawson, the flight attendant who had once asked Lillian to move, wasn't framed as a villain. Instead, Lillian presented her as a human being who had made a mistake, and more importantly, as someone who chose to grow from it. The crowd listened intently, nodding in agreement. Lillian's closing words carried the weight of experience and hope. "When you return to work tomorrow," she said, "I want to leave you with a challenge. How can you make someone's day better? Maybe it's a passenger, maybe it's a colleague, or maybe it's a stranger you'll only meet once. But whoever it is, choose kindness, choose respect. Those small choices, they're what shape our world." As she stepped back from the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation. The applause thundered through the hall. Lillian smiled softly, humbled by the response, but in her heart she knew this wasn't about the applause. It was about the ripple effect that had already begun. From the front row, Noah watched with pride. He knew this wasn't the result of months of corporate planning. It was a celebration of who Lillian had always been. Later that evening, as the conference wound down, employees gathered to share stories and reflections. Lillian and Noah mingled with them, listening firsthand to how the initiative had begun to reshape their experiences. Rachel Dawson, now a senior trainer in the Empathy Initiative, approached Lillian with a radiant smile. She stood taller, no longer the anxious, guilt-ridden woman from that flight. "Mrs. Hayes," Rachel said, her voice bright but grounded in gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, not just for forgiving me, but for giving me the chance to grow. This program, it's changed everything for me." Lillian's smile was soft and genuine. "You don't need to thank me," she replied gently. "You're the one who made the decision to change. That's all you, Rachel." Rachel nodded, but her eyes shone with appreciation. "I'll never forget what you taught me," Rachel said quietly. As the evening wrapped up, Lillian and Noah found themselves standing alone on the rooftop terrace of the convention center. The city lights sparkled below, stretching out into the horizon. They stood side by side, the night air cool but peaceful. Noah finally broke the silence. "Do you think it'll stick?" he asked softly. Lillian turned to him, her expression serene. "It already has," she replied. "It's not about perfection, Noah. It's about progress. As long as people are willing to try, change will always be possible." Noah smiled, pulling her a little closer with an arm around her waist. "You've done something remarkable, Lillian," he whispered. "Something most people wouldn't even dream of." Lillian rested her head lightly on his shoulder, her voice soft but resolute. "We did this together," she said. "And we're not finished yet." They stood quietly, gazing out over the skyline. Their journey wasn't over. The work of building a more respectful, empathetic world was ongoing. But as they held each other in the calm of the evening, they felt ready to keep pushing forward, together, because in the end, the smallest actions could lead to the greatest transformations. Respect transcends appearances, titles, and assumptions. It's about recognizing the shared humanity in everyone we encounter. True respect isn't passive, it's a conscious choice, made in the smallest moments, every single day. When we approach others with empathy, we build bridges of trust and understanding, ripples that extend further than we can imagine. Mistakes will happen. But growth begins the moment we acknowledge those mistakes and commit to doing better. In a world that often underestimates the power of grace, choosing kindness isn't just an act of goodwill, it's transformative. Respect is the foundation where real change begins. And that's the heart of this story, a reminder of how simple moments of dignity can reshape everything. What did you think of this journey and its powerful lessons? Let us know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another heartwarming story like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.